CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, reminds me of capitalism, and I'm here to tell you why. Very important disclaimer before we start. If CBT works for you, that is amazing. Stop watching this video. Do not listen to what I have to say, because guess what? If it works for you, the improvement you're seeing in your life outweighs anything I have to say about it. So please continue doing what you're doing. I love that that works for you. So why does CBT remind me of capitalism? I think it's because there's a saying about capitalism that it's the best worst system we have. So what does that mean? Best worst system basically means that we know it's a bad system, we know it does harm, we know it's not as effective as it could be. However, it's the best system we've actually been able to implement so far. Look, capitalism serves billionaires, okay? It doesn't serve you. It doesn't serve me. Yes, it's the system we live in. That doesn't mean I have to say it's a good one, right? We know that it's shit. We know that the divide between the hyper rich and people who are struggling to pay rent is getting bigger and bigger every day. Capitalism can serve individuals very well, but it does not serve society as a whole. And I think CBT is much the same way. If a person comes into therapy and they're dealing with a lot of anxiety, for example, it's much easier for the therapist to work on that person's thoughts about their anxiety and thoughts about their situation rather than actually providing help and assistance to change their situation. And in my experience, again, please take this with a grain of salt, and if CBT helps you, please ignore this, but in my experience, CBT can actually continue the cycles of harm that are creating the negative situations that I'm in, much like capitalism does. Because CBT and capitalism have something in common. You're at fault. You're responsible. It's all about the individual. And look, I'm not saying that mental illness is only caused by our environment. We know that the biopsychosocial model is the most effective, right? There are biological components, there are personality components, and there are environmental components. The problem with CBT is that it tends to completely ignore the environmental ones, and in fact tends to gaslight you about the environmental ones. Is collective liberation going to cure my depression? No. Is it going to make it a hell of a lot better? Yes. And the inverse of that is also true. When we ignore systemic oppression, our mental illnesses get worse because we're not understanding all of the components that are going into them. And in my experience with CBT, it just doesn't have the capacity. It is not robust enough to understand and hold space for the environmental things we are going through right now, the literal fall of democracy crumbling around us. If you're on board and you're like, yeah, no, CBT has never worked for me, but I never know what else to do, that seems to be the only therapy anybody ever does, allow me to tell you about some of my favorite alternative therapies. Some folks feel that DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, is just as bad as CBT, and I completely understand that, but for me, it's been very, very helpful. I've also really gotten a lot out of EMDR therapy, eye movement and desensitization and reprocessing therapy. It's usually used for trauma. And I've also gotten a ton out of parts work, also known as internal family systems. I hope this helped.